Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and today we're going to talk about a new exposure draft from the GASB on infrastructure assets. So this is sort of phase 2 of the project. They've already put out a preliminary views document last year, and so now we're taking a look at the exposure draft that kind of brings the whole thing together. So the title of this exposure draft is Infrastructure Assets, an Amendment of GASB 34. So you'll notice within there, a lot of the edits are two particular paragraphs within GASB 34 with the objective to improve the financial reporting requirements and enhance consistency in their application and better meeting the information needs of users. So again, we're carrying what we already learned in the preliminary views document forward here. So what are infrastructure assets? These are capital assets that are part of a network of assets stationary in nature and can be maintained or preserved for a significant number of years. We tend to think of things like roads, bridges, tunnels, but they've added information or communication towers, etc. when we look at some of the more modern types of infrastructure assets. It does clarify that buildings that have a primary purpose that is integral to a network of infrastructure assets, but are only an ancillary part of that network, should be considered infrastructure assets. So that is a clarification. So when we say a network, what do we mean? A network of infrastructure assets is composed of all assets that provide a particular type of service for the government. So again, it can be only one asset, but it can be many components. So a component is a separate distinguishable part of the infrastructure asset. So for example, a road has a road bed, overlay, curbs, gutters, right? But it's still part of the specific function of that asset, right? What do we use a road for? You can't have a road without the curbs and the gutters. So that all kind of comes together in terms of how we think about the network. We are retaining the two measurement bases. We have historical cost net of accumulated depreciation and the modified approach. They do clarify here if a component has a cost that is significant in relation to the total and the estimated useful life of the component is substantially different, then we should recognize a separate structure, a separate infrastructure asset in that scenario when we're calculating depreciation expense, right? So in that scenario, it would be used for the useful life calculation, for the determination of the expense, and then the purposes for required disclosure. In addition, it would require that governments perform a periodic review of the useful lives and salvage values to ensure that the depreciation calculation is correct. In terms of the notes for infrastructure assets that are at this historical cost, we would disclose by network of infrastructure asset the historical cost, accumulated depreciation, and historical cost weighted average of the assets that have exceeded 80% of their estimated useful life. What they've added in here for this disclosure, which I think is super interesting, is that a government needs to separate the infrastructure assets that have reached 100% of their useful life from those that have exceeded their 80%, but not yet reached their 100%. So again, really trying to understand, I've heard some statistics like 80% of our bridges, I think, were D or F rating in the US. That kind of scares me, right? That tells us how old some of those bridges are. If you're using the modified approach, it does amend GASB 34 to allow governments that meet the following requirements to use the modified approach. So first, you have to maintain an up-to-date inventory, no surprise, perform condition assessments on those assets, estimate each year the annual amount to maintain and preserve the infrastructure assets. And again, that'll also be both at the condition level and at the RSI level, and maintain documentation demonstrating that those assets are being preserved approximately at or above the condition required in the RSI by that government. They removed the 34 requirement to describe the modified approach to reporting infrastructure assets because, again, in that scenario, we already know what that is. We've had it for a long time. In terms of overall notes within the note disclosure about capital assets, infrastructure needs to be divided out by network of infrastructure assets. And they have with a policy for monitoring and maintenance and preservation, they need to briefly describe what that policy is in their footnotes. So the proposed effective date, we're looking at fiscal years beginning after June 15 to 28. So we're looking at fiscal end calendar 29. However, early adoption would be permitted. This is mostly prospective with a few exceptions to that in terms of application. All right, so if you are interested, the GASB would love to hear from you, so you can get your comments in, and they would definitely love to hear what you have to say in this area. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.